Hi, I'm Dave, and welcome to this Red Cloud Photography video tutorial. In this episode, we're going to look at manual settings. This is where you take complete control of the camera instead of the camera having control of you. Let's have a look. So when using the manual setting, we need to take our camera and set the dial to M. This means that we have complete control over the exposure of the camera, both the shutter speed and the aperture size, as well as the ISO. To control the manual exposure, there's one bit of your camera that you need to get very familiar with. I'm using a Canon here, but on your camera it will be exactly the same. Let's have a look through the viewfinder and let's explore the light meter. We can use our manual settings to completely control the exposure of the photograph. So I've set up a shot with Claire as a model. I'm going to do a portrait shot, but I'm going to do it in landscape mode so that I can demonstrate the light meter for you. I've half depressed the shutter button, which brings up my light meter on the display, and currently the cursor is right at 0, which means that I've got the correctly exposed settings for this photograph. I'm using f4.5 and shutter speed 1/160th of a second, and we'll take the first photograph. Thank you, Claire. So there we can see we've got a nicely exposed picture of Claire with the correct lighting levels for the photograph. So now I will use the aperture size to underexpose the photograph by 2 stops. So to underexpose it, again, I half depress the shutter release, and then using the correct dial, I can change the aperture up to f9, and that's moved the cursor back to -2. What that means is we've now got a smaller aperture for the same shutter speed, so less light is able to enter the camera, therefore the image will be underexposed. And I'll take the shot now. Cheers. Thanks, Claire. And as you can see, a very dark image is completely underexposed. Let me take the aperture back to the setting it was before, which is f4.5. And as you can see, the cursor's gone back to the center. And this time I'm going to take an overexposed image by 2 stops. And I'm going to do that by changing the shutter speed. So I'm now at 1/40th of a second, and the cursor has gone to +2 overexposed. And I'll take the shot. Cheese. There we go. And now this time we've got a much brighter, overly bright image of Claire as a result of more light entering the camera because of the way I've controlled the manual settings. And you can choose how you want to then manage your final image, whether you want it to be slightly overexposed or whether you actually want it to be slightly underexposed. In this correctly exposed picture, we see that all the light appears correct, the shadows are right, and Claire's complexion is as how it is. In this picture, all of the background has become dark, all of Claire's features have become dark, and you really are losing all the detail. And it really is not a good picture because it's underexposed. And in this final picture, all the detail has been what we term blown out because it's overexposed. There is too much light entering the camera, and that goes not just for the background, but also for Claire's complexion and her features. They're just lost in the blur of light. So setting the exposure doesn't always mean that you have to get the correct exposure for the shot by setting the light meter to 0. Sometimes it's of advantage to us to underexpose or overexpose the shot. In this example, we've underexposed the picture by 1 stop, which actually brings out the colour within the picture much more. It's enhanced it. So sometimes we underexpose to enhance colour. In this example, we've actually overexposed by 1 stop. This means that the model's features are much lighter, but also much softer. It's a much more pleasing composition for this kind of portrait, which we tend to call high-key portraiture. One really creative way to use the manual settings is to control the exposure triangle of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture size to actually paint light trails into an image. If we set a really slow shutter speed, but give a corresponding aperture and ISO setting to give a good exposure, and then take a photograph of a car moving through the frame, we can use the car's lights to paint a trail across the image, which can give some really creative effects. Fairground rides are also really good examples of how you can use this technique. There's no real right or wrong way of doing this. It's very much trial and error. So keep practicing, keep working on it, and keep checking the images as they're coming up on your screen so that you get the image that you really want. But remember, changing the aperture changes the depth of field that you use. Changing the shutter speed changes your ability to control camera shake. If you start to understand how to control the exposure using the light meter, the aperture and the shutter speed, you'll get some really great results and you'll start to be really creative and take control of your camera. So practice makes perfect. Here are some more examples of how to use the manual settings to get some really creative effects. That concludes Red Cloud Photography's video tutorial on the manual setting, a setting that really allows you to get creative with your camera and get the most out of its potential. I hope you found it really useful. Thanks for watching.